Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Harvey Collins is my name. I am 51 years old, and I have worked as a long-haul truck driver for 30 of those years. I've traveled across this nation more times than I can remember, witnessed each sunset over the plains and each daybreak over the Rockies. I've negotiated the concrete jungles of New York and Los Angeles, outrun tornadoes in Oklahoma, and coped with jackknifed rigs in Wyoming blizzards. I'm not the type of man who gets carried away by fancy. You receive what you see: a partially depleted coffee cup, a shabby flannel shirt, and a fair amount of skepticism about anything that cannot be attributed to poor wiring or bad weather. However, what transpired on the Blue Ridge Parkway one fall evening is another matter. No amount of truck stop coffee can make up for the cold this narrative has left in my bones. Late October was when the Appalachians gave their last spectacular performance of the year. There were riots of color throughout the mountains. Against the rich green of the pines, there are fiery reds, burned oranges, and bright golds. The smell of rotting leaves and woodsome smoke filled the cool air. I was transporting some light furniture from Roanoke to Asheville as part of a non-essential run. A pleasant diversion from the boring drone of the freeway was the picturesque path. Speed is not the purpose of the Blue Ridge Parkway. You have to slow down and navigate the road's twists and turns, the old land's outlines, as is so common in those highlands. A dense fog started to creep in as the day faded into the evening. The mist wasn't soft. The world was engulfed by a thick, damp blanket. Despite their strength, my headlights could hardly penetrate a 20-foot gap in front of my grille. A gallery of spectral skeletal figures replaced the forest's colorful tapestry. The only indication that anything else was there was the low rumbling of the diesel engine, the regular thump of my wipers, and the vastness of my cab. When I noticed her, I was making my way through a particularly tight set of switchbacks, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. A lone figure in the swirling grey. She stood on the narrow shoulder, barely in the line of my headlight beams. Being miles away from the closest town or picturesque vista made it an odd location for anyone to be. She had a thin shawl draped over her shoulders and was dressed in a plain, old-fashioned outfit, the type you might see in a black and white image. She was standing there, staring into the thick fog, as though she were waiting for someone, not thumbing for a ride. My initial assumption was that she must have had a car breakdown. Being stranded there was risky. The air brakes hissed in protest as I brought my tractor down to a crawl. I slid down the passenger window and pulled alongside her. The earthy scent of the woodland floor was carried by the cold, humid air that poured in. "Ma'am, you all right out here?" I yelled. My breath seized in my throat as she gently turned her head. Her face was both lovely and profoundly sad, and she was young, perhaps in her early 20s. Her big, dark eyes seemed to contain 100 years of sorrow. In the light from my dashboard lights, her skin appeared pallid and nearly translucent. She said the words, "I need to get to the bottom of the mountain," in a voice that was as faint and ethereal as the fog itself. "My family's waiting." I got a gut feeling that something wasn't right. No car was broken down, and there was no indication of an accident. This woman by herself in the dark and cold. I couldn't leave her there, though. That's not how my mother brought me up. I tried to seem comforting as I said, "It's a long walk and a cold night for it. Come on in. You can go to the next town with me." She moved to the passenger door after giving me a tiny, appreciative smile that fell short of her eyes. Leaning over, I opened it for her. With silent elegance, she climbed in and silently settled into the seat. The taxi, which had been my own haven for many hours, felt different all of a sudden, occupied by a presence that was both real and utterly surreal. I put the truck back in gear and added, "My name is Harvey," she answered. "Eleonora," in a voice so low I had to listen carefully over the engine. For a time, we drove in silence. I attempted to strike up a conversation by inquiring about her origins and her reason for being out on the parkway at such a late hour. Her responses were succinct and ambiguous. As though she were a part of the mountains, she talked about them. She painted with her words images of a bygone era, when little, independent settlements were tucked away in the hollows and horse-drawn carts were common. It was odd, but I explained it by the fact that she was from one of the more remote areas of the area, where customs were still practiced. The cold was the strangest thing. A chill swept across the cab as soon as she climbed in. The October night outside had little to do with the wet, cellar-like cold. With the fans roaring, I turned the heater up to full blast, but it felt like I was attempting to heat the outside. She seemed to exude a subtle, imperceptible aura of chill. When I looked over, I noticed that she had her arms tightly wrapped over herself and was shivering. A gorgeously woven scarf with a complex design of white flowers and a rich crimson hue was draped over her lap. I said, "Here," and threw off my bulky flannel jacket. "Take this. You will become quite cold." I saw a glimpse of something flickering in her eyes as she gazed at me. Astonishment, perhaps even appreciation. She mumbled, "Thank you," so I could put the jacket over her shoulders. As she nestled into it, I experienced a twinge of paternal anxiety. She appeared so frail and unnatural. We proceeded to descend the mountain slowly. There was no end to the fog, and the only sound in the cab was the steady hum of the wipers. I saw that I was getting sleepy, that the unnatural cold is finally being pushed back by the heater's warmth. In an attempt to remain vigilant, I shook my head. I had to give the road my whole focus. The passenger seat was empty. The passenger seat was empty. When I looked back, so I guess I was fixated on a particularly steep bend and the white line on the pavement's edge. My ribs were pounded by my heart. My rig groaned to a stop in the middle of the empty road as I stomped on the brakes. The taxi was deserted. They had locked and closed the passenger door. However, she had left. There was no way. The truck was traveling at 30 meters per hour. A door was open, but there was no sound, no fight, and no rush of wind. She had just disappeared. A sudden, chilly panic took hold. Was it all in my head? Was I hallucinating a passenger because I was so exhausted? My eyes darted throughout the cab, looking for any evidence. Then I noticed it. Her scarlet scarf lay on top of my flannel jacket, which was folded nicely on the passenger seat. I felt a shock at the sight of it. It was authentic. She was authentic. The scarf served as concrete evidence. Thing in an illogical circumstance. I grabbed it. In sharp contrast to the cold that had pervaded the taxi, the wool was supple and unexpectedly warm. I sat there for a while, the wipers continuing their lonesome pattern against the window, the engine idling. As I tried to piece together what had just transpired, my thoughts raced. No logical explanation could be found. Calling the police was my initial instinct. But what would I say? That a woman I picked up from my moving truck vanished? Would they believe I was insane, intoxicated, or worse? I had a clean truck driving record, and I desired to preserve it. Impulsively, and without understanding why, I swung the truck around. I had to turn around, but it was a tight turn on the little road. I needed to locate the place where I had picked her up. Perhaps I would discover a clue and provide an answer. It was as though the mountain itself was disclosing a secret when the fog started to clear as I drove back up it. I had no trouble finding the location, and a small wrought iron gate was situated just off the road, nearly obscured by a rhododendron bush. It was a cemetery's entrance. In the fog, I hadn't even noticed it. The headstones were moss covered and slanted, and the cemetery appeared ancient and deserted. I snatched the red scarf and a flashlight from my glove box with increasing dread. I pushed the creaky gate open and entered. The air was heavy and still. Rows of worn stones were illuminated by the beam from my flashlight as it pierced the night. Weather and time eroded their inscriptions. A weird sensation of being watched pricked the back of my neck. I moved slowly, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves. I have no idea what I was searching for, but I was confident that I would spot it. I read the names and dates as I went from stone to stone. Before I discovered it, the majority were from the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was a straightforward, tasteful headstone that looked down over the valley and was set aside from the rest, unaffected by the passing of time. The name etched into the granite was unmistakable. Born in 1901, Eleanora Vance passed away in 1923. My blood froze. She was the name. The stone said that she had been dead for almost a century. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing, and my thoughts swirled. It must have happened by accident. It must have been. The beam from my flashlight then struck the headstone's base. A tiny, beautiful blossom was engraved into the stone beneath her name. The crimson scarf I was holding in my shaking palm had the exact same pattern woven into it. The parts of the insurmountable puzzle clicked into place as I stood motionless. The narrative of her family waiting at the base of the mountain, the vintage outfit, the profound, lingering anguish in her eyes, and the journey she had been attempting to finish for a century. My hand trembled wildly as I stretched out and covered the damp, chilly gravestone with her scarf. I felt as though I was giving back something that had been gone for a very long time, and it felt right. An unexpected blast of wind blew across the cemetery, rustling the leaves and groaning through the pines as the scarlet wool brushed the stone. I briefly believed I heard a gentle whisper on the breeze. One word of gratitude. Thank you. I didn't wait for any more indications. I sprinted back to the safety of my truck after turning around. I continued driving until the sun rose and I was well behind the eerie peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I didn't go that way again. I think of her on some nights when I'm driving alone on a dark roadway. I remember the sadness in her eyes and the intense, unnatural chill. I can no longer claim that I don't believe in ghosts, even though I'm a pragmatic man. I gave one a ride, and I still have the ghostly garment in the buzzing stillness of my taxi, and I promise that occasionally, when the temperature drops, I can retain the subtle, pleasant aroma of a bygone era. Was this story enjoyable to you? Tell me in the comments. Remember to like this video as well. Let's move on to our next horrifying story. The name Samantha Reeves is mine. At the age of 34, I am a symbol of a paradigm shift in the trucking industry. Looking at me, the old-timers, with their dog-eared maps and intuition, see a child playing with toys. My taxi does not appear to be a typical big rig. It appears more like a tech business on wheels, a mobile command center. My top-of-the-line GPS has weather overlays, real-time traffic, and vehicle tracking. I have a multi-band CB and ham radio setup, a satellite link for my laptop, and a half-dozen more devices that help me stay informed, productive, and connected. I don't think the romance of getting lost on the highway is what trucking is all about. It's about the art of accuracy, the science of logistics, and the beauty of a well-planned route. I have faith in my tools. I have faith in data. I have more faith in my screen's crisp, rational, digital lines than in my own eyes. My eyes can occasionally be tricked by fog or exhaustion. Data is truthful. That's why the events in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park continue to cause me mental anguish on a deep level. It was more than a spooky experience. It was the complete collapse of my worldview. That night, something ancient, impractical, and horrifyingly real infiltrated and overthrew the digital world I depended on, the world of bits and bytes and unwavering logic. I was transporting a reefer full of fresh produce in a refrigerated trailer from a Knoxville distribution location to a Charlotte wholesaler. On I-40, a section of roadway renowned for both its breathtaking scenery and its dangerous, erratic weather, the route passes directly into the heart of the Smokies. It was my favorite kind of run late at night. Every four-wheeler is nestled in its bed. You may just locate your equipment, turn on cruise control, and log as many miles as you like on the deserted roads. The bubble of your headlights and the comforting, constant hum of the engine make the world seem smaller. But that night was different. A dense, soupy fog characteristic of the Smokies, had rolled in. They have a reason for being called that. It was no light mist. A thick, damp, oppressive blanket engulfed the entire world. Driving through a glass of milk was the analogy. My strong LED headlights, which are often capable of turning night into day, could not illuminate the area 50 feet in front of my grill. The beautiful, tall trees on each side of the roadway were merely shadowy, ominous patches, spectral forms that loomed and then vanished. It felt profoundly isolating. I was using a brand new Garmin with all the latest features as my primary GPS. The real-time car tracking is one of its most useful features, particularly for a lady driving alone at night. It displays other cars on the road as tiny electronic dots on the map, using a combination of network data and transponder signals. When you can't see, it's a terrific method to keep situational awareness. The screen was largely blank that evening, but for my tiny truck icon scuttling down a convoluted digital depiction of I-40, it made me a little nervous. The oppressive fog and the quiet intensifying the Job's inherent loneliness. In an attempt to break the boredom, I turned on my CB radio in the hopes of hearing human voices and conversation from other cars. I only received a wall of static, as though the radio frequencies were being smothered by the fog itself. I saw them for the first time then, on my GPS screen, not on the road. About 5 miles behind me, a string of new blips appeared on the map. First one, then two, and finally they swelled up in a quick waterfall. 5, 8, 10, an entire caravan. They were moving quickly, their digital icons steadily getting closer to mine. My initial response was one of relief. Out here in the soupy darkness, company, other souls, the world seemed somewhat less empty as a result. I continued looking in my mirrors, hoping to get a glimpse of their headlights' comforting, warm glow piercing the fog at any moment, but I couldn't see anything. Just the white wall behind me, swirling and impenetrable. I glanced at the GPS again. Now, about 2 miles back, the blips were closer. They moved in a tight, orderly pattern that seemed, to be honest, a little strange, and they were perfectly spaced. Truckers usually give each other plenty of space, especially in situations like these. This appeared to be more militaristic. March. I zoomed in on the symbols by tapping the screen. The GPS app is fantastic. If the network provides it, it can even provide you with basic car information. It simply stated that all of these were large goods vehicles. No transponder IDs, dot numbers, or firm names. Just 10 ghostly, anonymous blips are catching up with me. The base of my neck began to prickle with uneasiness. Leaning forward and trying to break through the fog, I strained my eyes until they ached as I checked my mirrors once again. Nothing behind me. The road was empty. However, my GPS, my reliable data-driven guide, maintained that a convoy of 10 trucks was now less than a mile away from my tailgate. In an attempt to find an answer, my rational mind went into overdrive. A bug in the tracking program on the server side, atmospherically induced localized sensor abnormality. Perhaps a caravan of soldiers testing a new stealth technology. That last one was more believable than the other, even though it sounded absurd and the subject of conspiracy theories. Something was whispering in my gut that the GPS was correct, but my eyes weren't. Now, the blips were directly above me on the screen. The first one's icon was so near that it overlapped mine, appearing to be right behind my trailer. My heart started beating against my ribs in a desperate, frenetic pattern. A chilly perspiration was pounding on my forehead. My gaze flickered between the GPS screen, which was screaming a truth that my senses strongly opposed, and the empty, fog-shrouded mirrors. I had the impression that I was torn between the real and virtual worlds. Additionally, they were giving me to whole different accounts. The digital had always been reliable. Then I heard it. It wasn't a contemporary diesel engine's high-pitched roar and whine. It was an old-fashioned symphony of engines, a low, guttural, multi-layered growl. The boom appeared to reverberate through my tires, up from the road, and into the seat frame itself. It was a resonant, deep hum that seemed very old and quite strong. The scent of diesel exhaust filled my cab, thickening the air, yet it was a richer, more bitter, oilier fragrance than I was accustomed to. It was the stench of an antiquated engine burning inefficiently. Behind me, slowly, as though emerging from the fog itself, came a pair of headlights. They weren't the LEDs of a contemporary vehicle, blazing white and aggressive, like the eyes of some gigantic nocturnal creature. They were perfectly round, dull yellow lights. My mirrors were then filled with a spectral procession of dimly glowing orbs hovering in the mist, followed by another pair that emerged next to them, and then another, and another. They were authentic. My GPS hadn't been acting strangely. All along, my technology had been correct. To go past me, the first truck moved into the left lane. My rational 21st century thinking was having trouble processing what I was witnessing. It moved up beside my taxi. It was a truck from a different age, either a Peterbilt or a Mack from the 1940s, featuring huge curved fenders over the front wheels, a tall, narrow cab, and a long, rounded snout. A patina of filth and rust covered it. It moved with a silent, unbreakable purpose, yet its paint faded to an unknowable dark tint. There was that ubiquitous low vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, without the thunder of exhaust or the roar of an engine as it passed. Desperate to see a face, to establish a human connection, to receive a wave or a nod that would normalize this circumstance, I glanced up at the driver's window. The filth on his glass masked the driver's form, making him a dark silhouette behind the wheel. However, the creature turned its head as if it could sense my gaze as the truck started to move forward, and our eyes locked for a moment. Nothing was there, only a vacant, blank stare. The eyes were dark sockets, without light, without life, without recognition. That truck was not being driven by a human. It was a hollow shell, an automaton, a puppet being controlled by an invisible hand. I felt a shock of utterly primitive fear at the sight. The other trucks in the convoy moved past me one by one. They were all identical, old-fashioned trucks from the 1940s and 1950s, remnants of a different era of trucking. A vehicle, a bulldog-nosed Mack, and a Diamond T. They all appeared to have been retrieved from the bottom of a lake, since they were worn and battered. Nevertheless, they moved with a strangely consistent elegance, and the identical story was told again in each one's cab. Those same lifeless, empty eyes, a short, slow turn of the head as it passed me, and a shadowy figure behind the wheel. Nobody gave a wave. Nobody's lights flashed. The parade of the dead was silent and spectral. I was paralyzed, my fists clenched over the steering wheel until my knuckles were white and my fingers ached. I had given up driving. I watched something that shouldn't have happened taking place, an observer of a parade that disregarded time and all the laws of physics. 10 pairs of dull yellow taillights formed an exact, unwavering line in front of me as the convoy drove ahead of me. On the roadway, in the fog, a funeral procession. The silence of it all was the most peculiar aspect. I could feel the constant low-frequency hum of 10 enormous heavy-duty trucks in my teeth, although they made hardly any noise at all. Their interactions with the physical world appeared to be abnormal. The damp road spray was not kicked up by them. They failed to buffet my truck as they went by in a gust of wind. They resembled a projection, a reenactment of a recollection on the night's damp, black canvas. For what seemed like an age, I followed them. A combination of horror and a peculiar, morbid awe made my mind go numb. I had a look at my GPS. It continued to follow them, with all 10 of its blips moving in perfect harmony. Then my blood ran cold as I saw something on the screen. The data on the map indicated that the convoy was getting close to a turnoff, an exit ramp that went to an ancient picturesque road. However, there was no way out when I peered forward through my windshield, glancing down the right side of the road. Only the mountain's solid rock face remained, a steep granite wall that had been blasted away to provide space for the freeway decades prior. The blips started turning on my screen. One by one, they separated from the virtual main highway and stepped onto the imaginary departure ramp. The lead truck in the actual world followed suit, and I watched with horror. It didn't go any slower. There was no signal. With its low headlights facing away from the road, it simply swerved to the right and collided with the mountainside. There was no crash. There was no screech of tormented metal, no explosion, and no shower of sparks. It simply faded away as it passed through the rock. Seeing a ghost pass through a wall was like that. The incident was flawless, frictionless, and completely unthinkable. Then came the second truck, then the third, and finally the fourth. In turn, each one drove soundlessly into the solid rock face and disappeared, their taillights flashing as the Smoky Mountains' ancient stone engulfed them. A massive, rust-covered tanker, the final vehicle in the phantom convoy, came up against the mountain wall. I had the crazy, scary idea that it was braking for me, beckoning me to follow them into the rock, into whatever spectral domain they inhabited. As its taillights briefly flared a brighter red, then it vanished as well. Then there was quiet. The faint murmur stopped. The old diesel scent subsided. There was nobody on the road ahead. I checked my GPS. The blips had all disappeared. Once more, it was just me, a single icon on a pitch-black screen, a lone observer in the oppressive mist. The wonderful blue sign for a rest station appeared after another mile of driving. I pulled in, my body trembling so violently that I was having trouble steering. With my hands shaking in my lap, I sat in the abrupt, deafening silence after killing the engine. I sat there till daylight, observing the mountain's majestic, solid, green slopes as the fog gradually dissipated. I attempted to explain it. Fatigue and the confusing fog caused a mass delusion, an advanced holographic trick. But I was aware of what I saw. The vehicles were visible to me. The drivers were visible to me. They drove into a mountain, and I witnessed it. And my dependable, rational GPS had also noticed them. I was unable to let it go. I spent my whole layover in a hotel room in Charlotte searching through internet archives. I looked up I-40, the Great Smoky Mountains, and trucker accidents. On old trucker boards, I discovered tales and local legends. A comparable route was taken by an ancient, dangerous two-lane road decades before the highway was blasted through the mountains. A notoriously accident-prone route. I was struck hard by one narrative that I cobbled together from a late 1940s digital newspaper collection. It described a horrific event in which a group of independent truckers, known as wildcatters, were transporting illegal alcohol out of the Tennessee hills without paying taxes. They were attempting to avoid tax agents while sprinting at night in a dense fog. In the rain-soaked darkness, a big part of the mountain gave way in a dramatic avalanche. 10 drivers and 10 trucks, all buried beneath thousands of tons of earth and rock. They were never found again. The mountain itself served as their burial. Even the disaster's coordinates were reported in the paper. I entered the coordinates into my GPS with shaking hands. On the map, the pin fell. The location was perfect. The precise location where the interstate is now operational. That was the precise location where the ghost convoy had pulled off the highway and headed home. I continue to travel that way. I must. It's what I do. However, I no longer have as much faith in my technology as I once did. Or perhaps I have more faith in it. I am aware that some things exist that are impossible to quantify or monitor using standard methods. A separate type of data trail is left by objects that run on a different frequency. I switch off my CB radio, look away from my GPS, and hold my breath every time I pass that location in the Smokies, especially when there is a lot of fog. I hope to an unknowable God that the road behind me remains vacant, that the road behind me remains vacant. Daniel Price is my name. I am 42 years old and have spent the majority of my adult life moving cargoes across the Appalachian heartland. I specialize in large, heavy machinery, mining equipment, excavators, and bulldozers. I frequently travel US Route 23, also known as the Country Music Highway, but it's the spine of coal country to folks like me. It's a road that meanders across an incredibly beautiful yet impoverished area, a location where the specters of the past seem to be extremely near the surface. These mountains and the people who live and die there have always held a special place in my heart. That respect, however, changed one night into a harsh, icy fear that still haunts me. It was an early spring night without a moon. My flatbed was laden with a brand new continuous mining machine that was headed to a location close to Pikeville. I drove north through eastern Kentucky. My entire focus was needed to pull the machine, which was a multi-ton beast made of steel and tungsten carbide. With steep, forested hillsides on either side and the occasional shadowed silhouette of a chilly tipple, the route was dark. This land has sacrificed its wealth, and occasionally it seems as though the people's souls have been stolen in exchange. Here, the weight of history is palpable, as are the echoes of tragedies, strikes, and difficult lives. My headlights spotted something on the shoulder up front as I was descending a long, steep gradient. The man was standing motionless. This wasn't totally out of the ordinary. There was something strange about him, even though you see people wandering these roads all day and all night. Something that caused my arm to stand on end. The details became clearer as I approached, and my uneasiness turned into real alarm. He wore traditional miner's clothing. It was vintage clothing, not the reflective striped, hard-hatted kind of today. He was dressed in bulky canvas pants and hefty boots covered in dirt, a worn jacket underneath a basic flannel shirt. He donned the soft headgear with a small flickering carbide lamp affixed on the front, the type they worn before hard hats were required. His face was bathed in a faint shimmering light from the lamp's flame. I slowed the truck as of my natural want to accelerate and flee clashed with my curiosity. He had no intention of flagging me down. His body was tilted toward the dark, forested hillside on the other side of the road. His shoulders drooped as though he were bearing a huge weight, and he appeared worn out. My heart was stopped by his face. It appeared to absorb the light from my headlights because of the heavy layer of frigid dust covering it. However, it was his eyes. As long as I live, I will always remember his gaze. As I got closer, he turned his head and looked at me through the windshield. He was staring with wide eyes, but they weren't really eyes. In his blackened face, there were two dark, empty sockets that appeared to be hollows, voids that seemed to draw in all the hope and light in the world. They had the expression of a man who has witnessed the horrors of the deep ground and left a piece of himself behind in the darkness. But there was no hatred or hate in them, only a deep, unending emptiness. I experienced a shock of utter fear, a chilling dread that began in my stomach and moved throughout my body. My foot crashed down on the accelerator after hesitating over the brake. All I wanted was to leave. I dared to look in my side mirror as my truck roared past him. Although he was still standing, he had lifted one arm, a grimy hand on it. He was pointing up the steep, overgrown hillside across the road, not at me. For a few period, he maintained the posture, a quiet ghostly beacon, before the darkness engulfed him again. Like a trip hammer, my heart was pounding. Before my hands stopped shaking enough to drive safely, I drove 10 more miles. Stop. The cold night air did little to slow my pounding heart as I stepped out of the taxi. In my heart, I knew it was a local oddball, but I tried to convince myself it was only a trick of the light. I couldn't get those lifeless eyes out of my head. I couldn't get rid of the sensation. He pointed in a purposeful, meaningful manner. I had a terrible want to find out more, even though I knew better. After dropping off my cargo in Pikeville the following day, I made a stop at an ancient diner, the kind where the people have been sipping the same coffee for 50 years. Sitting at the counter, I tried to appear informal as I talked about the section of road where I had seen the man. I was overheard by an elderly man who was seated on a few stools. His face resembled a road map of the coal seams in the area. He set down his coffee cup and gave me a knowing glance. "You saw him then," he uttered in a gruff, low voice. "The pointer." My blood froze. "The arrow?" Slowly, he nodded. "Been spotted on that particular road for almost 80 years. Always the same, pointing up to the hill while wearing the outdated equipment." He related the tale to me. That hillside was the site of a tiny independent mine in the 1930s. They referred to them as dog hole mines, which are extremely dangerous, unlicensed, and inadequately supported. The collapse was devastating one rainy afternoon. A cave-in and a methane explosion. That day, a dozen men were working the seam. They didn't make it out. Rescue operations were a nightmare. It was too precarious to enter the mine. The family were left with nothing more than a sealed-up hole in a mountainside for a gravestone when the corporation that owned it filed for bankruptcy. The bodies were never found. The old-timer went on, his voice fading to a whisper. One of the men was a young fellow named Silas. He had just started working there. They claimed that 4 days, his wife and children hoped for a miracle at the mine entrance. They claimed that until his body is removed from that hill and given a respectable funeral, his spirit will not be able to rest or depart. He informed me that occasionally a nighttime motorist spots him standing beside the road, constantly pointing to the location where, except from the oldest residents, the entrance to the lost mine is now entirely overgrown and forgotten. He's not attempting to frighten anyone, the elderly man stated. He's merely requesting assistance. He's indicating his residence. The diner's happy conversation turned to a muted buzz as I sipped my coffee in silence. The tale enveloped me like a layer of icy dust. Hatred was not the reason behind the miner's hollow eyes. His soul was still imprisoned in the oppressive blackness of the earth, a mile beneath the mountain, which is why they were empty. Not that he was a monster. He was a soul that had been lost. He was always pointing to his own grave. That night, I returned down Route 23 with my flatbed empty. I reduced the speed of my pickup as I got closer to the location. I killed the engine and pulled over to the shoulder. After getting out, I stood where I had seen him. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and damp ground, and the night was silent. I glanced at the dark, impenetrable wall of trees and bushes on the other side of the road. There was only a steep, untamed slope in sight, and no indication of an ancient mine. But I was aware of its presence. I sensed it. The weight of those dozen neglected and buried souls was palpable to me. I remained on the side of the road for a long time, keeping a silent vigil. I murmured a silent prayer for Silas and all the others who were lost to the deep darkness, but I never saw him again. I hoped that they would eventually find tranquility. I continue to drive on the route. It's what I do, but I always think of him when I walk by that location. I believe I can occasionally make out a small indentation in the slope, where the earth once settled, when the light is just right. Thinking of him no longer makes me feel afraid. It's a deep grief now. I am among the select few who have witnessed his silent appeal and know his secret. I see the hollowed man who longs to return home, the ghost of the coal country. Please click the like button and leave a comment below if this story made you shiver. There's another terrifying story to come. Let's go on. Terrifying story to come. Let's go on. Everyone who knows me calls me Angie. Even though my name is Angela Moore, I'm 29, and I've lived in the cab of a Peterbilt 579 for the past 5 years. I entered this world for the independence, for the sense that I am in charge of my own ship and am only subject to the tyranny of the timetable and the open road. I don't get scared easily. I've developed my toughness and independence. I've slept comfortably in my cab in some of America's most shady and dilapidated truck stops, the type in which your gasoline tanks and doors are locked. Aggressive drivers have attempted to run me off the road. Additionally, I've driven through storms that would cause most people to stop and offer prayers to an unbeliever. I've always had a straightforward philosophy. People are the most hazardous things in the world, not spirits. A man with malicious intent poses a serious risk. A ghost is merely a tale. However, I learned a difficult lesson on a storm-tossed night in the deep, dark forests of West Virginia. It showed me that there are some areas with a gloom that is completely unrelated to humanity. A recurring frightening reminder that some lights are better left unchecked and certain cries are better left unheard. The memory now flickers at the back of my mind like a fading candle. As part of my daily routine, I was transporting a shipment of dry goods through the Appalachian highlands' tortuous two-lane highways. It was late October, when the mountains are losing their flaming hues and getting ready for the long, chilly winter slumber. After being clear all day, the weather suddenly turned ugly. Horrifying brutality. A violent, biblical feeling thunderstorm rolled in off the mountains. The sky became a purplish dark, scarred and angry. My wipers couldn't keep up with the rain, which was falling in thick, wind-driven sheets. An unrelenting, blinding wall of water appeared as soon as they cleared the glass. Overhead, thunder splintered. It was a sudden, explosive shock so close and loud that it felt like the sky was being torn apart just above my taxi. Not a far-off rumble. There were more than just flashes of lightning. The entire terrain was illuminated by large, jagged forks that created brief, frightful, stark white tableaus. My huge truck was beginning to seem dangerously light, as if it may hydroplane with every gust of wind, and the road had turned into a perilous black ribbon of water. The risk was too great to go on. Out here, my GPS, which is typically my lifeline, was worthless. With the phrase gaining satellite signal, the screen simply displayed a grey nothingness. I was using an antiquated paper map, a memento I had stored in my glove compartment for precisely such a situation. I had a straightforward plan. Look for a secure spot to stop and wait out the storm. But safety was a luxury on these winding, tight roadways. The muddy, soft shoulders dropped perilously toward deep ditches. I could make out a narrow, unpaved stretch off the main road ahead thanks to my headlights, which were fighting the flood. It appeared to be an ancient route used for logging, a rutted, muddy road that vanishes into the forest's darkness. I never would have imagined driving my 18-wheeler down such a lane on a typical night. It was a certain way to get trapped and sink to my knees in mud. However, I was about to pass it when the landscape was brightly lighted by a flash of lightning, and I caught a glimpse of a tiny clearing 100 yards away in that moment of heavenly, dreadful light. It appeared to be precisely the right size for my rig and was flat. It was a risk, but it was preferable to being a huge metal target in a lightning strike or a sitting duck on the roadway. Storm, I took a big breath and decided. I eased my pickup off the asphalt with caution. The changeover. The tires make a startling lurch when they strike the muddy, squishy ground. As I struggled for traction, the rig moaned and grumbled, the tires whirled in the mud, and the engine whined. For a heart-stopping instant, I believed I had made a grave error. However, I was able to persuade the vehicle to move ahead into the clearing's relative safety once the tires caught. After guiding the rig out of the track, I turned off the engine. It was a deafening hush. The diesel's noise had stopped, displaced by the distant guttural roar of thunder and the unrelenting, mesmerizing beating of rain on my cab's roof. It was completely dark all around me. I turned off my headlights to conserve the battery for the lengthy wait. The outside world disappeared. I felt as though I was at the bottom of the ocean, as I was sunk into a profound and all-encompassing blackness. The darkness was oppressive and confusing. It was going to be a long wait, so I settled in. From my thermos, I poured a cup of lukewarm coffee. The usual acridness, a tiny solace. I looked at old family photos on my phone as I browsed through them, of my dog, attempting to add some warmth and brightness to the chilly, dim cab. An hour went by. There was no indication that the storm would abate. The initial relief at getting off the road had given way to a creeping claustrophobia and an increasing sensation of loneliness. Normally my roomy kingdom, the cab was beginning to seem like a cage. I looked out the windshield, attempting to make out anything save my own dim reflection and the rain-stained glass. The world was illuminated by another dazzling, jagged bolt of lightning, and I saw it in that moment of glaring black and white realism. A cabin was tucked away in a hollow I had no idea existed, perhaps a quarter of a mile from where I was. It was the kind of place you'd see in a horror film, small and run down. The wood was ghostly grey from weathering. The entire building appeared to be tilting to one side, as though worn out from its protracted struggle with gravity, and the porch roof was drooping dangerously. My breath caught in my throat, but it wasn't because of that. I noticed a light in one of the windows in that fleeting bleak glow. One yellow light, steady. My initial response was one of utter relief. There was another person out here. There were others in this wilderness besides me. Perhaps they had a weather radio or a working phone. Perhaps they were amiable people who would offer a hot cup of coffee. That relief, that hopeful tiny spark, however, was soon smothered, curdling into bewilderment and finally into an unavoidable, creeping sense of dread. The cabin appeared to be a complete ruin, with no adequate road going to it. Who would live in a property like that so far into the woods? What caused only one light to be on? Not the cozy multi-wind radiance of a house in use. In the shadows, it was a single, vigilant eye. I was unable to turn away. I held on to observing the location where I had saw it. I pressed my face against the window's icy glass, anticipating the next lightning strike. When it arrived, it validated my observations. The cabin stood there, a dark, hunched figure against the trees that thrashed in the wind. In the suffocating blackness, the light remained, a dim, unflinching pinprick. It was not the swirling, flickering light of a gas lamp or a candle. It glowed like an old incandescent bulb, steady, dull, and unflinching. At this point, my mounting panic began to lose the battle with my logical mind, the part of me that believes in reason and physics. Electricity is necessary for a light bulb to function. Every time I saw a flash of lightning, I looked about. Out here, there were no power wires. Since leaving the main highway miles ago, I hadn't seen a single utility pole. A generator, perhaps that was the next sensible move. Over the storm, however, I was unable to hear the distinctive chug-chug-chug of a generator, and among the tremendous fury of the weather, the light seemed so serene, so quiet, so completely out of place. I was unable to look away from it. It was captivating. In the midst of a harsh environment, a small, improbable glimmer of purported civilization, I started inventing tales to justify it. My reasonable brain's desperate attempts to regain control. It was a quiet solar-powered battery system that was used by an elderly recluse who lived off the grid. The hunters were using a silent inverter generator while holed up in their cabin. However, none of the justifications seemed appropriate. Like the falsehoods you tell yourself as a child who is afraid of the dark, they felt weak and frail, as if the monster in the closet were nothing more than a stack of clothing. A fresh sound reached me as I sat there looking, my mind racing with contradictory ideas. The rain's regular beat was broken by it. I initially assumed it was just the wind's strange moaning through the trees because it was so faint. However, it was more organized than that. It was music, a small, recurring, sorrowful tune akin to an old-fashioned waltz on a scratchy wind-up camera. It was a faint, spectral sound that seemed to emanate from the direction of the cabin. It wound through the trees. I felt a real physical chill, the result of the phantom music and the constant impossible light. This was incorrect. Everything about this circumstance was deeply, essentially incorrect. It was a screaming instinct to run, to just start my motor and risk the storm-soaked highway. However, it was equally horrifying to imagine trying to back my 80,000-pound rig above this muddy area in the dark as the trees were tearing at my trailer. I felt confined, a bystander to a spectacle I couldn't understand and couldn't get away from. Then something was different. After being eerily constant for almost an hour, the light in the window flickered once, twice, and then extinguished with a final faint pulse. In some ways, the darkness that surged in to take its place was more profound and absolute than it had been previously. The woods, which had formerly provided a single point of reference, now seemed to be a vast, empty, and frightening emptiness. The spectral music had ceased. Only the storm disturbed the silence. With my eyes fixed on the location where the light had been and my heart thumping painfully and frantically against my ribs, I held my breath. The wail was then heard by me. It wasn't noisy. The wail appeared to be carried on the wind itself, slender, melancholy, and ethereal. It was an undiluted sound of utter anguish. It was a wail of sorrow so deep and heartbreaking that it made my arm and neck stand on end. It was a woman's voice, but the storm had stretched and warped it, making it sound terribly, dreadfully inhuman as it reverberated through the woods. For a painful time, the cries keening Regretful sound grew in pitch before fading away, engulfed by a thunderclap so loud it shook the ground. For me, that was it. My composure cracked like a dam. A primitive, overwhelming yearning to escape took the place of reason, logic, and practicality. The mud didn't matter to me. The storm didn't matter to me. I was indifferent to the possibility of jackknifing. It took me 3 tries to insert the key into the ignition as I struggled for it with trembling hands. The most lovely and reassuring sound I had ever heard was the engine's familiar, strong rumbling as it came to life. My headlights continued to shine, piercing the rain and darkness with a blanket of bright, comforting white. With my eyes, I threw the truck into reverse. I prayed while my eyes were riveted on my mirrors. Great rooster stories of water and muck were thrown everywhere as the tires spun, and I thought I was stuck for a moment. Then they were captured, though. Tree branches screeched and scraped over the side of my trailer, like skeletal fingers attempting to hold me back. I backed out of the clearing and into the narrow track, until my wheels touched the highway's heavily firm tarmac. I didn't stop. I shifted the truck into gear, turned the wheel, and started driving. Which way I was going didn't matter to me. All I did was drive. After 2 hours of driving, my adrenaline gradually and painfully drained out of me, leaving me completely worn out and unsteady. The first grey, watery light of morning started to seep over the horizon as the storm finally passed, moving on to torment another area of the highlands. I finally let myself stop after finding a legitimate truck stop that was well lit. I sat there for a while, trying to take in what had happened that night, watching the sun rise and other trucks come and go. A few weeks later, I chatted with Earl, a seasoned truck driver who had been operating these mountain routes since before I was even born, at a depot in Ohio. I told him the story on the spur of the moment, partly expecting him to call me a lunatic and laugh at me. Novice, he didn't, as I said. He simply listened quietly, his countenance stern, and nodded slowly. He took a long, deliberate sip of his coffee after I was done. He remarked in a gruff, low voice, "It seems like you discovered the Miller place." He told me about a local folklore, that area of West Virginia, that his own grandfather had told him. The Millers were a family who lived in that isolated cottage in the 1920s. John, the spouse, worked as a logger. He went out one night to remove a fallen tree that was obstructing the track during a horrible storm that was very similar to the one I had experienced. He was instantaneously killed when a widowmaker, a big broken branch, broke under the force of the wind and fell. Half mad with grief, his wife Elizabeth refused to accept his absence. She believed that he was just lost in the storm. She would therefore light a single electric lamp in the window each night. She would play their favorite music, a sad waltz, on a wind-up picture, and they were proud to have one of the first domestic generators in the county. She waited for him to find his way home, see the light, and hear the music. About a year after her husband's passing, the cabin caught fire one night. According to some, a log moved in the hearth. Others claim that in her distraught, insomniac state, she knocked down a kerosene lamp. Because the cabin was so far away, it was already too late when someone noticed the flame's brightness against the clouds. The fire claimed the woman's life, awaiting a husband who will never come back. They say her spirit still waits on stormy nights. Earl remarked, his voice fading to a near whisper. She's unaware of her death. She switches the light on, in the hopes that he will eventually return home. She plays the music. She also recalls the fire when the storm worsens and the thunder claps exactly perfectly. She recalls the agony. She screams for him once more as the light goes out, right before the flames devour her. I've never returned to the region of West Virginia. I instruct my dispatcher to provide me with alternative routes going forward. Even if they're longer, my mileage bonus will suffer. It's worthwhile. However, I occasionally think about that cabin while I'm driving late at night and a strong storm approaches. I consider that lone, unattainable light. That eerie, mournful music comes to mind, and that wail of unadulterated, eternal anguish comes to mind, and I am reminded that loneliness in the dark is not the only thing that might happen. Waiting for a light that will never bring you home, the worst thing. Never bring you home, the worst thing. Victor Shaw is my name. I am 47 years old and a talkative. It has always been. I could talk the ears from a cornstalk, according to my wife. That can be a boon out here on the road. Long periods of isolation can wear you down. And I've always discovered that a stimulating conversation, even over the CB with a complete stranger, can speed up the passing of time. I'm also the type of person that will pull over to lend a hand. I need a ride because I have a flat tire and no gas. Your man is me. I'm just wired that way. However, I picked up a passenger one misty evening in the North Carolina mountains who showed me that sometimes kindness is more powerful than words, and that reimbursed in ways that are beyond your comprehension. I was traveling along US 19 toward Tennessee while towing a cargo of lumber. With its steep gradients, hairpin turns, and magnificent drop-offs, the route is both attractive and challenging. Visibility was reduced to around 100 feet due to a dense fog that had descended into the valleys and clung to the road. It was the type of weather where you stiffen up, lean forward, and concentrate only on the white line at the pavement's edge. My headlights rescued him from the darkness as I rounded a turn. His thumb was out as he stood on the narrow shoulder. He was a young man, most likely in college, with a basic jacket, wearing pants and toting a little backpack. Unlike some of the rougher folks you see attempting to get a ride, he had a clean-cut appearance. He simply had the appearance of a stuck child. My employer often has a stringent no-riders policy, liability insurance, and other corporate policies. I couldn't abandon him, though. When I saw this child standing miles away from anything on the brink of a perilous road in the growing fog, I made a quick choice. With a sigh from the air brakes, I slowed my truck and stopped just in front of him. He was so relieved that he jogged up to the passenger door. I pushed the door open while bending over. "Where are you headed, son?" I inquired. He said, "Just trying to get to the next town, sir," in a quiet and kind tone. "A few miles ago, my automobile broke down. Any ride would be very appreciated." "Climb in," I responded, grinning. "It's a nasty night to be walking." Placing his backpack at his feet, he entered. "Thank you, sir. Many thanks, a lot. Adam is my name." I pulled the truck back onto the road and said, "Victor, I'm happy to assist." I started right with my regular schedule. I questioned him about his origins, his plans, his studies, and whether or not he was enrolled in college. I was attempting to make him feel at ease by filling the void. He was unusually silent, though. He gave brief, nearly evasive responses. He would merely nod, respond with a single word, or say, "Yes, sir." He kept his hands firmly clutched in his lap and stared straight ahead most of the time. I assumed he was simply bashful or perhaps scared by the breakdown of his car. I therefore performed what I do best. For us both, I filled the void. I told him tales of the journey. "If you must know, I told you about my near misses and the strangest load I ever transported a truck loaded with rubber chickens. I discussed my retirement plans, my family, and my children." He simply sat in the seat beside me, a still, silent presence, nodding slightly now and then. The road was growing increasingly dangerous, and the fog was growing heavier. We were approaching an area that was notoriously hazardous, a network of switchbacks and blind turns etched into the mountainside. There was a strong rock wall on one side, a guardrail, and a lengthy, shadowy descent into the valley below or located on the opposite side. The child Adam started talking when we got closer to the first of these sharp turns. His voice had changed. I was astonished by the urgent, authoritative tone that had replaced its gentle politeness. He added, "You need to slow down," while keeping his gaze on the road in front of him. I was already moving slowly, perhaps 25 meters per hour, but his voice was so demanding that I automatically depressed the accelerator. I said, "It's a bad corner, I know," in an attempt to sound comforting. "Slower," he demanded in a deep, husky voice. "Take a break." There was an authority in his voice now that defied debate. By applying the brakes, I brought the rig down to a crawl, about 15 meters per hour. As we started to negotiate the blind turn, the truck moaned. My hands were firmly gripping the wheel, and my eyes were fixed on the road. "Be ready," he said in a barely discernible whisper. Then we turned the corner. My blood became icy. The path ahead had vanished. The highway had been entirely destroyed by a huge rock slide. Both highways were strewn with boulders, the size of my vehicle, a waterfall of smaller pebbles, and uprooted trees. I wouldn't have had time to respond if I had been moving at my typical pace, even my cautious 25 meters per hour. That wall of rock and dirt would have been directly struck by my equipment. My momentum would have propelled me over the edge into the black abyss and through the guardrail. I have no doubt that I would have been killed. I applied the brakes as forcefully as I could. The trailer threatened to jackknife as the truck squealed and shook, but I was moving so slowly that I was able to halt the rig with perhaps 10 feet left. A huge, jagged boulder was nearly brushing my front bumper. I sat there, breathing in ragged gasps as my heart tried to beat its way out of my chest. I was trembling from head to toe, feeling a rush of adrenaline and fear. I had been just feet away from a brutal demise. I turned to the passenger seat after what seemed like an age to thank Adam and the child for saving my life. However, the seat was vacant. The taxi was deserted. The passenger door was shut. He had lost his backpack. He had disappeared. My mind refused to believe what I was seeing as I gazed at the vacant seat. There was no way. Maybe 5 seconds had passed since I was halted. He couldn't have left that quickly and without making a sound. I would have sensed the surge of chilly air and heard the door open. But nothing was there. He simply vanished. My legs were shaky and unsteady as I staggered out of the taxi. In the fog, I gazed about. My voice shouted out, "Adam, Adam." No response was found. Only the tiny trickle of water from the rock face and the sound of my own strained breathing. I strolled around my vehicle. He was nowhere to be seen. He had vanished as quietly and totally as a phantom. I needed some time to gather my thoughts before I could report the rock slide on the CB radio. Road crews arrived and started the drawn-out process of cleaning the highway, which took hours. I shared my tale with the first state trooper on the scene at that moment. I told him about Adam, the hitchhiker who had advised me to slow down before vanishing. After patiently listening, the Aid Tulu trooper offered me an oddly empathetic glance. "Driver," he remarked, "a lot of strange things happen in these mountains. You're quite fortunate. You should be thankful for him, no matter who or what he was." He was correct. I was fortunate. I was still here, but I was plagued by its mystery. Was he a spirit? An angel of protection? Had my own subconscious been screaming a caution at me? I had imagined him because I was so stressed out by the fog, but he was so authentic. The weight of him in the chair, the courteous silence, and the abrupt urgency of his voice to save lives. I never got a response. No other young man had been reported on that road. There was never an abandoned car discovered. It was as though he had descended from the heavens to save my life, and then gone back to his starting point. Hitchhikers are still picked up by me. The business policy is doomed. I feel as though I'm making a loan payment. I'm paying a little more attention to the quiet ones lately, though. I pay as much attention to the quiet as I do to the noise. Additionally, I always slow down when I get to a blind bend in the fog and silently thank Adam, the hitchhiker who was there and then wasn't. The greatest gift of all, my life, was left behind by the guardian angel who arrived on a desolate road and vanished at the next bend. Patricia Long is my name. My age is 38, and instead of blood and intestines, you would most likely discover logistical tables and diesel fuel if you cut me open. I'm realistic and pragmatic. Transporting temperature-sensitive medications on squeaky-tight timetables is my line of work. Being anything else is not an option for you. Time is money, but it's also viability to me. A few hours delay result in a 500,000 shipment of life-saving medication becoming a rotten, useless slurry. I firmly believe in tire pressure, proper maintenance, the dependable Kenworth T680, and the unbiased information my GPS offers. Ghost stories, local folklore, And the kind of campfire stories other drivers tell at 3 in the morning are not things I believe in. To stay conscious. Spirits and superstitions do not rule the world. Physics and deadlines do. Before a last-ditch detour close to Asheville, North Carolina, pulled me into a place where the past isn't just dead and buried. That is, at least, the world I lived in. It is imprisoned. It is yelling and attempting to escape. From the beginning, the run was cursed. It was a vital and urgent hotshot load from a Knoxville source to a large Charlotte hospital. It's the type of run where everything must go flawlessly. Nothing did, of course. My departure was delayed by a valuable 90 minutes due to a paperwork error at the depot. Then I-40 became a parking lot just outside Knoxville. 4 miles, traffic was at a standstill due to a collision between a pickup vehicle and a tourist's RV. I sat there in a rage, watching the minutes pass on my dashboard's digital clock. Each one is a tiny nail in my schedule's coffin. My trailer's buzzing refrigerated units served as a continual reminder of the pricey, fragile cargo whose viability was gradually eroding. My GPS, the fortunate digital heart of my operation, gave me hope after 2 hours of crawling. It chirped and made a detour and recalculated. A convoluted network of county roads and state highways that would avoid the traffic completely and travel through the hills, dark countryside west of Asheville. It would theoretically save me at least an hour, if not more. I had never traveled that path before. A maze of uncharted back roads. Bad idea, cried my gut. The part of me that is all trucker, the pragmatic woman with the temperature-sensitive goods, and the ticking clock overruled it, saying, "Stay on the main roads, the known quantities." An hour was an hour. I went out. Almost instantly, the world was altered. Narrow two-lane roadways with soft shoulders and faded yellow lines replaced the broad, well-lit interstate. A deep, profound rural darkness descended like a blanket once the sun had set. On either side, the tall, old trees crowded in, their branches creating a canopy that obscured the stars. Through a completely vacant world, my headlights created a lonely tunnel. It was only me, the endless winding tarmac, and the deep rumble of my engine. My gamble appeared to be paying off for a while. I was moving quickly, and the deserted roads were a wonderful change from the sluggish highway. My shoulders started to loosen up. Perhaps I would succeed after all. My GPS beeped once more. Turn right in a quarter of a mile. It wanted me to turn into a road that was hardly a road at all. It was a small, crumbling asphalt road that resembled a deserted driveway more than a county-maintained thoroughfare. The path was marked with an ancient, rusted sign that was partially obscured by a dense ivy curtain. The paint was chipping and the words Helen's Bridge were hardly readable. The path itself led straight to the entrance of a brief tunnel with a stone arch, with a chill of undiluted reluctance coursing through me. I slowed the rig to a crawl. It was a hideous tunnel, constructed from enormous, rough-colored stones that had been darkened by a century of dirt and moisture. It appeared to be very old. Water soaked through the fissures, leaving the stone with unsightly, black stains. It didn't look like an engineering endeavor, but rather a black, yawning mouth in the side of the hill. It appeared to be a wound. It appeared to be the entryway of something ancient, irate, and better left alone. My GPS chirped as I recalculated, its happy electronic voice a sharp contrast to the ominous scene in front of me. This is the quickest path. After a brief pause. Go ahead. Every instinct I had was at odds with the pragmatic side of me. On the interstate, the concept of that was a waste of time. The possible loss of the shipment, the picture of my dispatcher's irate face, all of it propelled me on. I murmured out loud, my voice faint and little in the great blackness. It's just a tunnel, Trish, 100 yards of asphalt and stone grab hold. After inhaling deeply, I prepared myself and pointed my rig in the direction of the aperture. Everything changed the instant my front bumper stepped through the door. The change was not gradual. Like switching a switch, it happened instantly. My cab's previously comfortable 70 air abruptly turned thick, heavy, and unbearably chilly. It was a soggy, cellar-like cold, the kind that makes your teeth hurt and seems to be soaking straight into your bones. I took one look at my thermostat. The air I was breathing was cold, although the temperature was still around 70. It was a blast of furious screeching static on my radio, which had been playing a happy tune about beer and pickup trucks from a local country station. The soft hiss of a dead signal was not it. It sounded like a physical assault, since it was so loud, rough, and forceful. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I flinched and quickly reached out to smack the power button. In some ways, the ensuing deep hush was worse. Even though the tunnel was only 100 yards long, it seemed like a mile. Slick with a slimy greenish wetness, the stone walls felt as though they were closing in on me. The interior was completely dark, a living, breathing blackness that was barely illuminated by my strong LED headlights. Only a few feet in front of my grill, they appeared to be engulfed by the darkness. The acoustics were completely off. The sound of my Kenworth's engine's reassuring rumbling was muffled and far away, as though it were taking place somewhere else. A sound memory instead of the actual sound. My own frightened heart's gentle thud thump was the sole sound. Then the yailing began. A woman's screech of sheer panic, a single high-pitched wail, seemed to originate right in front of my truck. Instinctively, I slammed on the brakes, my eyes searching the darkness for anything, a person, a wrecked car, anything. However, nothing was present. There was nobody on the road ahead. Another scream joined the previous one before I could process it. And then another. They were in the air in a matter of seconds. There were more than a few cries. Hundreds of frightened, anguished voices screamed out in unison, creating a chorus. I had them in my taxi. I saw them outside my taxi. I had them in my mind. It was a symphony of damnation, the sound of unadulterated horror and agony. In the dreadful choir, I could make out individual voices, the shout of a man in pain, loud and guttural, the screech of a lady in grave fear, high and piercing, children's pitiful, thin reedy cries. It was the simultaneous sound of 100 last moments. A wave of ghostly pain washed over me. I literally flinched, pushing myself back into my seat, as though I could get away from the sound, because it was so visceral and genuine. I put my hands over my ears and pressed so firmly that my head hurt. However, the loudness was not muffled by it. My eardrums weren't only being struck by sound waves. It was within me, resonating in the cranium's hollows and vibrating in my bones. I could sense the scream's unadulterated emotion, the fear, the agony, and the despairing awareness that death had arrived. Panic, icy, abrasive, and complete, grabbed me. The sheer impossibility of what was happening dissolved my reasoning thinking. It wasn't an echo. They were the dying people's cries, and now they were taking place. My truck's electronics went berserk as the screams intensified to a crescendo of sheer anguish. The dashboard, my lovely, dependable collection of gauges and digital readouts, died after flickering wildly. The screens turned dark. I lost my temperature readings, my fuel gauge, and my digital speedometer. An eerie blackness took the place of the dash's cozy, inviting glow. My headlights then went off. The world disappeared. I found myself in a scary state of utter darkness, so devoid of sensation that I was unable to determine whether my eyes were open or closed. The shrieking was all that was present. I was blind, confined in a metal box, and surrounded by the voices of the damned for a moment that seemed to last forever. The headlights flickered weakly and sputtered back on. The PMS dropped erratically as the engine, my beloved Cummins, coughed and sputtered, as though experiencing a seizure. The entire rig trembled violently. It had the impression that an evil force from the outside was attempting to destroy its nerve system from the inside out. I took the only possible action. I responded. My foot stomped down on the accelerator after being stuck on the brake. The electronics, the engine, and the payload didn't matter to me. All I wanted was to get out of that damned, horrible place, out of the cold, out of the yailing. The tunnel appeared to go on indefinitely. The exit, a taunting pinprick of light in the distance that never seemed to approach. The screams clawed at me as they followed, a surge of ghostly pain that appeared to be attempting to stop me by physically pushing on my truck. I could practically hear ghostly fingers scratching at the paint and feel phantom hands pressing on the glass. Then it was finished as abruptly as it had started. My truck exploded out of the tunnel and returned to the peaceful, normal night in North Carolina. It felt like a switch was flicked once more the moment my trailer passed through the stone archway. The yelling ceased abruptly and without natural cause. The stifling bone-deep cold in the cab was immediately replaced by the typical air conditioning. The lights on my dashboard flashed back on. All of the screens and gauges are restarting and getting back to normal. A reassuring, lovely assurance. The engine's steady. Strong growl softened out. I continued. I was unable to. My eyes were wide, my foot firmly planted on the ground, and my heart was attempting to beat its way out of my chest. I was trembling so badly that my teeth were chattering out of control, and the entire cab seemed to vibrate. After another 15 minutes of driving, trying to get as far away from that tunnel as I could, I came to a broad, well-lit area by a fruit stand that had closed. With awkward, uncoordinated movements, I pulled over. My legs buckled as I swung the door open and nearly fell out of the taxi. Beneath me, my stomach heaved as I fell to my hands and knees on the gravel shoulder, panting for the refreshing night air. I remained there for a while, just breathing, attempting to return my heart rate to a somewhat normal level. Never in my life had I been so afraid. I felt violated and soiled as a result of this fear, which transcended the bodily and reached the depths of my spirit. I forced myself to stand up when my breathing eventually evened out and my legs felt strong enough to support me. I leaned against my truck's side, the cool metal providing a firm and reassuring presence. My thoughts were racing. Had I dreamed of a waking nightmare triggered by tension and weariness? A delusion? I required evidence. To bring me back to earth, I needed something concrete. With my flashlight beam shaky in my fingers, I walked around my setup. Actually, I was searching for something different, but I was checking for damage from the electrical fit. The humming of the engine was flawless. All the lights were steady and bright. It appeared as though nothing had occurred. However, something had occurred, and as the beam from my flashlight hit the passenger side of my taxi, I discovered the evidence. I came to a complete stop. Handprints were all over my truck's side, from the passenger door to the 53-foot length of my shiny white trailer. The tiny layer of road dust that had gathered during my drive made them easily apparent. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of them. They were neither streaks nor smudges. The prints were clear and frantic. The little, flawless prints of children, the prints of women with thin fingers, and the prints of men with big, wide hands. From as high as a human could reach to as low as the tires, they were jammed up against the metal at every possible angle. Some were flawless, showing every line and swirl as I sped off. Others were smeared downward, as though the hands had been slipping down the side of my truck. They were a crowd's handprints. A frightened, frantic, and desperate mob was reaching out from the tunnel's darkness, clinging to something tangible, something real, something that would help them escape their agony. I gazed at them while experiencing a new wave of sickness and a churning stomach. I touched the border of one of the smaller prints with a shaking finger, a child's handprint at the height where a tiny child would be standing, directly on the passenger door. Even if it was only an outline in the dust, the evidence was indisputable. Evidence that I wasn't insane. Evidence that what had happened to me was frightfully, unthinkably real. I stayed by the side of the road there for the remainder of the night, too scared to move, too scared to be in the dark by myself once more. I only sat in my taxi, keep the engine running and the lights on till the first grey rays of dawn appeared. I opened my laptop and looked up Helen's Bridge, Asheville. Later, when I was securely in Charlotte and the sun was shining with a cheery, mocking brightness, the legends of the area flooded my screen. The most frequently told tale concerned Helen, a mother who had lost her cherished daughter in a fire. She had gone to the nearest bridge and hung herself from the stone archway because she was so distraught and overcome with sadness. They claim that the tunnel is still haunted by her tortured ghost, and she will come if you call her name. However, I discovered further stories as I delved deeper into local history forums and old newspaper archives. Older, more sinister tales that were not mentioned on the travel websites. In one report from the 1940s, a terrible accident was described. Inside the little, dark tunnel, a chartered bus that was transporting families home from a church picnic had stopped. It was too late for an intoxicated driver operating a large truck that was traveling too quickly to notice the bus. The bus's gasoline tank was ruptured in the disastrous impact. The ensuing conflagration was confined inside the stone walls of the tunnel. No one survived. According to the account, the screams were the last excruciating moments of those passengers who were stuck in an oral loop that would never stop playing their fear for anyone who dared to drive past. The handprints were their final, desperate attempt to reach out and claw their way out of the flames, leaving their mark on everything that came into contact with their world. I delivered on schedule. The cargo was in good condition. However, I wasn't. On that dark drive, I lost something more significant than an hour. I lost my cozy, practical perspective on the world. I was no longer protected and sane by my shield of doubt. That morning, I used a high-pressure hose to remove all of the handprints from my truck. I can't erase them from my memories, though. They are still as visible to me as day. The cries are still audible to me. I am now aware of the sadness and suffering that permeate some locations where a catastrophe was so severe that it permanently altered the course of history. The past isn't always the past, especially if you're unlucky enough to take the wrong shortcut on the right night. You'll discover that it still screams. Although my name is Gerald Dawson, I go by Jerry at the truck stops and on the CB. My spine is formed like the driver's seat of a Peterbilt, and I'm 55 years old. Originate from a period before satellites surveyed the Earth, and a plastic box on the dash spoke in a nice disembodied voice. With a dog-eared coffee-stained Rand McNally Atlas, a memory honed by need, and a gut instinct for the highway's beat, I mastered the highways the old-fashioned way. My most trusted tool has always been my mental compass. Like the lines on my own hand, I am familiar with the back roads of the Appalachians, the abandoned state highways, and the twisting county roads. In the deep, dark hours, I have witnessed my fair share of unusual occurrences, including animals that move too quickly to be genuine and mysterious lights in the sky, fog that appears to be acting independently. However, I'm a man who thinks rational explanations are valid. Bad weather, light trickery, and exhaustion. If you're sober and sane enough to look for it, there's always an answer. Also, I believed. After driving for 35 years, I continued to believe that. A snug barrier against the kind of tales that make your hair stand on end. But I ended up on a route I knew by heart one starless night in Virginia's old sleeping mountains. A road that decided all of a sudden that it wasn't done with me. Additionally, it showed me that not everything can be explained logically. There are things that are simply hungry. I was driving a refrigerated trailer load of produce up through southwest Virginia, a typical run that I could complete while I slept. A straight shot up a state highway I'd driven hundreds, if not thousands of times. The goal was a distribution center, just over the state line. The time was late, most likely around 2 a.m., when everything seemed to be holding its breath. I was moving quickly, the road was deserted, and a black ribbon was spreading out into the night. Long-distance truckers are familiar with the cozy, contemplative condition I was in, immersed in the hypnotic dance of the white lines beneath my headlights, the familiar drone of the diesel engine, and the repetitive pounding of the tires on the pavement. On this long, dark stretch, I crossed a mental checkpoint that I always used to indicate my progress. The country church was modest and whitewashed, with a notably tall steeple that pierced the night sky. Nestled in a grove of old, towering oaks, it was set back from the road. An ancient, corroded metal sign for a discontinued brand of chewing tobacco was affixed to one of those oaks just beyond it. Its white and red paint turned to a spectral brown and pink. It was like receiving a warm nod from a longtime friend. Okay, I told myself, feeling a comforting familiarity descend upon me. The interstate turnoff is another 20 meters away. Run easily. I reached into the thermos next to me and took a drink of my lukewarm coffee. On the radio, the host of a late-night talk program was fielding callers regarding conspiracy ideas. In the silence of my taxi, his voice was a soothing, low whisper. Miles passed by. Through the darkness, the route wound and turned. It was rolling hills as usual. Every turn of a well-known motion. My hands on the wheel have a muscle memory. However, a weird sensation started to prickle at the back of my neck after I had been driving for 15 or 20 minutes. A persistent feeling of déjà vu. I was navigating a series of curves that felt a bit too familiar, a sharp left followed by a long, sweeping right. I had just driven it, it seemed. I gave a little dismissive shake of my head. I mumbled, "I'm getting old, Jerry. You were tricked by fatigue. The late night runs wear you out in ways that they didn't in my 20s. But they do so now. Even when the road doesn't loop, your mind does." I ignored the sensation and continued to drive. Then, ahead, I could see it coming out of the shadows, brightened by the glaring white light from my headlights. The rusty tobacco chewing sign is located directly beyond the modest whitewashed country church with the towering spire. A chilly knot tightened in the pit of my abdomen. I depressed the accelerator a bit. My thoughts were racing as I slowed the truck, attempting to comprehend the impossibility. It seemed unthinkable that I could have turned around somehow. I could have made a mistake, because this was a straight roadway without any significant crossroads or turnoffs. Perhaps two identical churches, or two identical, long-forgotten tobacco signs affixed to a tree were present. It was the only logical explanation I could think of, but it was a remote possibility, a one-in-a-million coincidence. It must have been. In an attempt to make the pieces make sense, I tried to ignore it and kept driving. The simple familiarity, however, was gone this time. I was on guard, my knuckles somewhat harder on the steering wheel, my eyes searching the darkness. I spent 20 more minutes driving. There was a commercial break in the discussion radio broadcast, and the cab's quiet was heavy with an odd, anticipatory tension. With each mile, the sense of uneasiness grew. Now the road felt unnatural. The branches of the trees appeared to be reaching for my pickup like skeletal fingers as they appeared to encroach. The cab's air felt heavy and challenging to breathe. I looked in my mirrors. Behind me, the road was a pitch-black emptiness. I had the impression that someone was watching me even though there was nothing there. Then I noticed it once again. The sign, the steeple, the church. I felt electrified, frigid and panicked. There was no coincidence here. There was no déjà vu here. I was caught up. It was the same old road. Before my head could even come up with the idea, my body acted, and I slammed on the brakes. The large rig moaned and screamed, finally stopping in the midst of the empty highway. I sat there, trying to make sense of the impossibility, while my heart pounded like a caged bird against my ribcage. I was caught up in a hiccup in reality, a geographical stutter. My pride and delight, my personal compass, were spinning pointlessly. I was being misled by the road. However, as I gazed at the landscape this time, I became aware of a change. My eyes strained in the headlight beams as I peered intently at the church. More whitewash was flaking than I could recall from the initial pass. Large leprous areas of it were flaking off, exposing the dark, warm wood underneath. Once perfectly aligned, a shutter on one of the upper windows now hung crookedly from a single hinge, swaying gently in an unseen breeze. The old tobacco sign appeared to have aged 10 years in the last 20 minutes, as evidenced by its rustier appearance and more faded hues. The scenery was deteriorating. It was decomposing. I started to feel a kind of fear that I hadn't had since I was a kid, the fear of the monster beneath the bed. It was more than a loop. It was a spiraling downward. The path wasn't monotonous. It was humiliating. I had to shatter it. I needed to leave. When I put the truck in motion, the grinding noise of violence broke through the silence. In defiance, the engine roared as I stamped on the accelerator. By sheer willpower, I was going to outrun it and make it to the other side. This time, I drove more quickly, my eyes wide, taking in every detail as I tried to commit the actual route to memory. so I could compare it to the following one. Go ahead. Every bend and dip in the road was an exact, frustrating duplicate of the previous pass. I was like a needle on a skipping record, repeatedly playing the same frightful, scratchy groove. 20 minutes later, the church reappeared, this time in ruins, like a sight from a reoccurring nightmare. Get out of it. It was a skeletal remnant of its former self. It looked as though a powerful gust of wind would send the tall, majestic steeple tumbling to the ground, bending at a perilous inebriated angle. The roof had black, gaping holes where great chunks of shingles had disappeared. No longer were the windows just dark, they were broken. The vacant frames resemble a skull's hollow eyes. A crust of fiery orange rust had nearly eaten the tobacco sign, which was barely clinging to the tree, and the towering oaks that stand next to the chapel. They had passed away. Their branches, which resembled the arms of the condemned, were skeletal and barren, black and twisted against the night sky. The world was rotting around me with every step, and the process was getting faster, even though it was the middle of a beautiful Virginia summer. At that moment, I was positive that the fact that I couldn't outrun it chilled me to my core. I was losing the terrible game of cat and mouse that the road was playing with me. The deterioration was accelerating with every iteration. What might the upcoming pass entail? The church fell into a heap of debris. Under my wheels, the road itself was collapsing into dust. I experienced a smothering, crushing sense of helplessness. The maze was crumbling in on itself, and I was a rat in a maze. A new, much more horrifying thought crept into my head as I passed the destroyed cathedral for the third time. What if the world outside my window wasn't the only thing deteriorating? This loop included the truck. I participated in this loop. What if my truck was the victim? To me. I looked down at my steering wheel hands. My hands weren't those. The hands belonged to an elderly man, stretched taut over a network of protruding blue veins and twisted knuckles. The skin was as thin and translucent as parchment. They had liver stains all over them that I had never seen before. They trembled, a pause shaking that I was powerless to stop. I gasped in horror and choked. I looked up at the rearview mirror with grim dread. There was a haggarded old me in the visage that gazed back. I had white, thin hair. Deep-set wrinkles were a travel map on my face. My cheekbone skin is drooping, and my eyes were wide with an ancient horror. The eyes of a man who had spent an hour stuck on this road, but forever. That was the tipping point. My paralysis was broken when I saw that withering stranger in my own mirror. I wasn't merely being trapped by this road. I was being consumed by it. It was consuming my life and time, making me older with each step. I refused to be destroyed by this road. I refused to be just another ghost story told at a truck stop. I made a desperate, crazy choice as I got closer to the location where the loop appeared to reset, just beyond the spectral skeletal picture of the dilapidated church. I wanted to follow the road. It asked for it. My sole responsibility was to follow the road it had outlined until I vanished into thin air. Therefore, I wouldn't. I turned the steering wheel hard to the right and let out a guttural shout that was equal parts dread and wrath. The curve wasn't what I was going for. I was pointing my 80,000-pound equipment straight into the thick, dark woods that surrounded the road. To hell with you. Whatever evil, time-eating power had imprisoned me, I screamed at the road at night in a harsh voice. With a powerful lurch, the truck left the asphalt, the front with a bone-jarring thud that made my teeth jangle in my brain. The wheels struck the soft shoulder ground. A row of small trees and underbrush was smashed through by the rig. The noise was a deafening clamour of scraping metal, screeching, and shattering wood. Branches that resembled claws ran up my taxi's side in an attempt to stop me. It was a rash act of suicide. It could have gone 1,000 ways. I might have been crushed when I struck a huge, invisible tree. I could have destroyed the cab by jacknipping the trailer as it swung around. I had the option of rolling the entire rig down the steep, invisible hillside, but I chose not to. Following roughly 50 yards of a violent, the truck's front end was buried deep in a thicket of rhododendron when it abruptly lurched to a halt after a wild and shaky voyage through the forest. The leaves pressed hard and leathery on my windshield. There was complete stillness after that. There was a stuck engine. There was complete silence. I sat there with my ears ringing and my body trembling from the violent hit and adrenaline. I was off the road even though my chest hurt and I was positive I had numerous bruises. I was not informed. The cycle was broken by me. I inhaled deeply and shuddered. Once more, the cab's air was normal. The sensation of a hefty charge had vanished. Raising my hands slowly and tremblingly, I examined them in the faint light of the emergency lights. My hands were those, calloused and weathered from a lifetime of work. My hands were 55 years old, yet they belonged to me. The liver spots had disappeared. The shudder had vanished. I took a chance and looked in the mirror. Even though my face was pallid and drenched in cold sweat, it was still me, my wrinkles, my greying hair. Once more, I was myself. I had freedom. To obtain a tow vehicle to take my rig out of the woods, I had to spend the remainder of the night and the first part of the next morning. The driver, a weathered local with a bulge in his cheek from chewing tobacco, simply shook his head while assessing the damage. "Must have been one hell of a deer, old-timer," commented the man. I simply nodded. Yet my voice said, "What an incredible deer." Although it was a falsehood, it was far simpler than the truth. In actuality, I had operated my truck to get away from a ghost into a woodland, the ghost of a road, a place so enmeshed in repetition and loneliness that it had learnt to feed itself rather than a ghost of a person. I no longer drive that section of the highway at night. I'm going to go the extra mile. If necessary, extend my travel by a few hours. Despite his complaints, my dispatcher is unaware of what I know. I am aware of the potential of that road. The road is a hungry one. Time, reality, and the sanity of anyone unfortunate enough to fall into its never-ending, rotting embrace are its food sources. The cycle was broken by me. I left. The road, however, is undoubtedly still there, waiting in the dark, appearing as innocent and normal as ever, and waiting for the next lonesome motorist to pass the small whitewashed church and start the cycle over. Maria Lopez is my name. The smell of diesel road dust and the subtle, pleasant aroma of the air freshener hanging from my rearview mirror fill my 31-year-old world. Mateo, my son, chose a small pine tree for me. In a world full of seasoned veterans, I've only been driving for a few years. My passion for equipment and the romance of the open road are not the reasons I entered this field. I started it in order to create a better life for Mateo. His future is built on every mile I drive, every load I deliver, and every lonesome morning I witness from my taxi. I have a taped picture of him next to the speedometer on my dashboard. His hair is slicked back in this school shot, and he has a toothy 5-year-old grin that stretches from ear to ear. That image serves as my co-pilot, compass, and constant companion during the long, lonely evenings. It is difficult to be a mother while traveling. Being split in two is a continuous state. That little smiling picture is a part of my heart that I always have with me. And there's always that bigger chunk back home, hundreds of miles away. My sister's text messages with images of his most recent Lego construction and facetime sessions. When I see him lose another tooth are how I live my life. Perhaps that is why I was so profoundly impacted by what I witnessed in West Virginia's hollows. I had discovered more than a ghost story, and it was a wordless, heartbreaking pantomime that spoke directly to the part of me that will always be connected to my child and mother's greatest fear. In the middle of what was once coal country, I was transporting a tanker of non-hazardous industrial lubricant. There is a paradox in the terrain, a spot of spectacular natural beauty that nearly brings tears to your eyes. However, the profound, unhealed wounds of a defunct industry have left it scarred. You go through ever-rolling, verdant mountains. The hillsides are covered in rhododendron and trees. The skeletal remains of a settlement will then suddenly interrupt the beauty as you round a corner. A few run-down homes with porches that collapsed in on themselves like elderly guys letting out a sigh. The company store was boarded up. Its windows were like blind eyes, and the rusting skeleton of a cool drink loomed constantly on a neighboring hill, like a community's grave and a tribute to a vanished way of life. The air in these locations is thick with a sense of loss that permeates everything like the constant fog. In a region so steeped in memories and solitude, your contemporary roaring engine feels like a sacrilege and an intrusion. When the sun started to set behind the mountain ridges, it was late afternoon, that enchanted, gloomy time of day. The hollow shadows lengthen and deepen, extending like dark fingers as the light becomes golden and syrupy. One of these ghost villages, which my map showed as Blackwood Creek, was what I was passing. However, nothing remained that could be given a name. It consisted of only a dozen or so dilapidated homes, their paint worn away by years of severe winters and muggy summers. I had to slow my truck to a crawl, since the town's road had collapsed at the edges. I looked around the ruins as I made my way across the cracked asphalt. I noticed them at that point. A group of youngsters were playing on an overgrown area of ground in front of what must have been the town's one-room schoolhouse, a slightly larger, more collapsed edifice than the others. 5 of them, about 6 to 10 years old, were present. I was initially struck with complete, unadulterated shock. Out here, who would be residing miles away from any thriving town? This location was a ruin. What family would move into a ghost town out of desperation? And who would let their kids to play in the rotting wood and corroded metal? It seemed reckless and risky. I let my truck to move at a walking speed. Keep your pace. My interest was piqued. Then, as I peered more closely, I felt a cold that was unrelated to the cool evening air, beginning at the base of my back and working my way out. They were dressed in vintage attire. The 2 girls were dressed in long-sleeved blouses and modest fading pin skirts that I had only seen in sepia-toned photos. The 3 youngsters were dressed in newsboy caps and patched overalls. The dirt they were playing in has smeared and frayed their clothes. Some sort of ring or tag game involving the Rosie was what they were playing. They move with ease and a boundless youthful vitality. With their cheeks glowing with anticipation, they pursued one another through the tall weeds in broad, happy circles. But what broke my heart was their laughter. None existed. They were performing in complete and utter quiet. Not a single sound made it to my ears, even though their lips were open in what should have been peals of laughter and exuberant, frantic cries. It was a silent movie outside my taxi. I saw a boy chasing a female with pigtails while wearing a cap backwards and his mouth hanging open in a wordless yell. Her face was a picture of laughter and fake fear, and I could see her staring over her shoulder. However, the only noise was the crunch of dirt beneath my tires and the quiet rumble of my engine. I had never seen something so eerie in my life. The ideal picture of happiness, totally separated from the sound it ought to produce. The dim light was a projection of a recollection. With my trucker's instinct telling me to keep going and escape this wrongness, I slowed my truck to a sluggish, crawling crawl. However, I was enthralled and appalled by the mother in me, the part of me that saw my own son's mischievous energy in their quiet motions. I was unable to turn away. My enormous, loud vehicle, a 40-ton metal beast that had invaded their universe, was completely ignored by the kids. Their bare feet kicked up dust as they resumed their silent game, their faces glowing with silent ecstasy. It whirled in the late afternoon sun's golden rays. A young girl wearing a worn blue dress and long dark locks stumbled when she caught her foot on an exposed path. As I came nearly parallel to them, the smallest of the group, with a little, silent burst of dust and thrashing limbs, she fell hard. The other kids stopped playing their game right away. They forgot about the chase. Their expressions, which had been light with laughter just a moment ago, were suddenly engraved with matching masks of concern as they hurried to her side. The young girl gripped her knee and sat up. She was obviously crying. She sobbed and her little body trembled. The universal expression of infantile grief and distress twisted her face. Through the dirt on her cheeks, tears made neat trails. Her sobs, however, were as hushed as the laughs, a silent scream of sorrow that was nevertheless more penetrating than any sound could have been. It was a pantomime of grief. I had never witnessed anything so awful. I reached up and tapped my horn without thinking, my maternal instincts taking precedence over all other considerations. A soft, brief puff of air, not a complete blast. The type to attract someone's attention without shocking them. You do this, and in the great, still hole, a gentle meep meep. Even though it was a faint sound, it broke the quiet environment like a boulder breaking through a piece of glass. The 5 kids all froze. They all turned to face my truck in spooky synchrony. Everything had vanished, including the playful spark in their eyes and their whirring for their companion. It gave way to a look of profound, heartbreaking despair. Just moments ago, their faces had appeared bright and vibrant, but now they were pale and translucent in the dark, their features blurry, like watercolor paintings exposed to the rain. They had enormous, black eyes that were filled with a sorrow so deep and ancient that seemed to be a bodily burden in the taxi. Not only were they depressed, but they were absolutely and totally lost. They gazed at me with a sort of silent, frantic need rather than fear or rage. It seemed as though they were actually seeing me for the first time, and they were searching for something they had long since lost in my face and presence. A voice to respond to their mute pleas, a mother, and a house. The young girl on the ground halted her quiet tears and simply gazed. A mask of frantic optimism covered her tear-streaked face. My breath seized in my throat as I glanced back, my fingers motionless on the steering wheel. Tears filled my own eyes, making the unthinkable scene in front of me blurry. I wasn't a truck driver on a timetable at the time. I was merely a mother observing a bunch of children who had gone missing. I recalled Matteo, his contagious laughter that filled our small apartment, my better kisses on his bruised knees, and the solace that a simple embrace could provide. There was no one for these kids. Without nobody to listen, they were echoes caught in a quiet loop of a long-forgotten summer afternoon, playing, falling, and sobbing incessantly. Their figures wavered as I gazed, immobilized by a grief that seemed both urgent and old, transparent as smoke in the evening air. They began to lose their solidity. Their edges merged with the town's deteriorating shadows. The first to vanish were the 4 standing kids, who stared at me with wistful eyes until they were reduced to a shimmering cloud of heat. Then they vanished. The last to disappear was the young girl wearing the frayed blue dress. She stayed a little longer, her hand still gripping her knee, her tiny body still resting on the ground. She gave me a direct look, and the last thing I saw of her before she too vanished entirely was the decaying foundation of an old schoolhouse, a gnarled tree root, and an overgrown area of weeds. Back in rushed the world. Now my engine's rumbling seemed deafening. My cab's air seemed frigid and thin. For a minute or more, I sat there with tears running down my cheeks. My mind was etched with the picture of their dejected, white faces. At last, I mustered the strength to shift the truck into gear and leave. I felt a pain in my heart that wasn't mine, an intense sorrow over a catastrophe had just seen. Later that night, I was unable to sleep when I arrived at a truck stop. I was unable to eat. The picture of the quiet kids kept coming up. I opened my laptop as I sat in my cab, the cozy glow of the truck stop lights seeming like a planet away, my fingers shaking. I looked up Blackwood Creek, West Virginia. It required some research beyond the blogs on urban exploration and the ghost hunter forums. In a computerized county historical archive, I eventually located what I was looking for: a digitized copy of a February 1952 Logan Banner newspaper article. It had a stark headline: "In Blackwood Creek, diphtheria claims 7 lives." The story was told in the article. A devastating outbreak of the so-called strangling angel had spread across the remote Blackwood Creek mining camp in the winter of 1952. The hollow had been snowed in by a vicious blizzard, rendering the routes impassable for weeks. The sickness was terrible, and they had no access to doctors or the antitoxin that could have saved their lives. In just 2 weeks, it killed 7 children as it swept through the small, close-knit town with horrifying speed. According to the story, the town never fully recovered from the loss. It had been torn of its heart. A few years later, the mine closed, leaving the families with nothing to keep them there. However, the houses and the schoolhouse were left to the mercy of the mountains as ghosts simply drifted away. There was a tiny black box with a border at the bottom of the piece. The names of the deceased children were listed: Miller, Caleb, age 10, Jones, Samuel, age 9, Lillian Walker, 6, Elijah Peters, 8, Sarah Beth Peters, 7. I looked over the list. 5 kids, 5 names. The ages were consistent with what I observed. My breath caught. The young girl in the blue clothing is Lillian. One by one, I read the names. In the silence of my taxi, my voice sounded like a hoarse whisper. They were no longer only ghost kids. They were named. They were authentic. They were cherished and lamented. They were confined. I continue to go across coal country. I have to do that for work. However, I still remember that. Those kids are always playing their silent game in my mind. Time robbed them of their tears and laughter. Additionally, on my dashboard, adjacent to the image of my lively, boisterous, and smiling son, I have a small, faded printout of that article from the newspaper that I save. It serves as a reminder of both the brittleness of life and the sadness that seeps into these mountains' very foundation. Additionally, it serves as a memorial for the 5 Blackwood Creek silent children who, for a few fleeting moments, broke through 70 years of quiet to share their devastating loneliness with a mother who happened to be walking by on the street. And each time I go through those voids, I pray that they will eventually discover a tranquility that life has denied them. Hello, I'm Russell Hayes. I'm 44 years old and a habitual person. I travel the same routes. The same truck stops are where I stop. And since I know I won't be disturbed, I sleep in the same distant pull-offs. Being a big person 6 feet 3 inches, 250 pounds, I don't become scared of anything on the road because I've been driving for a long time. I've defended myself in altercations in bars. I've dealt with men who tried to steal my fuel. And I've never once felt powerless over my circumstances. I've always associated fear with a tangible threat that you could see and combat. However, I discovered what real fear is one moonless night when camped in my favorite remote location in the Appalachian mountains. What you can fight is not the point. It's about what you are unable to do. The creature without a face is the subject. What doesn't produce sound? The thing that chooses to accompany you in the truck. I'm referring to a little, unmarked dirt pull-off on a peaceful section of the roadway. It is sufficiently removed from the road that the occasional passing automobile is only a faint murmur, and it is encircled by a thick old-growth forest. It was my haven, a place of absolute silence and tranquility. After parking there for the night, I went about my daily business, ate a cold sandwich, called my wife, and read a book while I slept. It's completely black outside. There are no city lights, no street lights, nothing. It's a dark, primordial darkness that seems very old. I was lying there in the dark, listening to the soft hum of the truck's auxiliary power unit and the crickets outside. After turning off my reading light, it was quiet. I saw it at that moment. I caught a glimpse of activity at the edge of the woods via my sleeper's little window. At first, it was difficult to tell. I believed it to be a deer. I watched motionless. It wasn't an animal, though. It was a shadow. However, it was incorrect. Something wasn't casting a shadow. It was the actual object. It was a towering, unnaturally slender figure that appeared to separate from the tree-iron's darker interior. It was a moving vacuum that resembled a man, but was longer and stretched out like a figure in a warped mirror. It was darker than the night. For a considerable amount of time, it remained still. A chilly shiver of uneasiness ran through me. Ever the rationalist, my mind searched for an answer. Moonlight slipping through the clouds is a trick. In the low light, my eyes are playing tricks on me. Illumination. However, the moon was absent. Then it started moving. It didn't move. It moved smoothly. There was no sound as it moved smoothly and silently across the pull-off's gravel. It went straight for my truck. The crickets, which had been singing non-stop, stopped. Outside my taxi, everything fell silent. All I could hear was my own heart thumping suddenly and frantically. I froze. A fear so pure and intense that it overrode all of my fight or flight reactions and went straight to freeze paralyzed my body. I was immobile. I was having trouble breathing. All I could do was watch this monstrosity come closer. It was at least 7 feet tall, with long, slender limbs that ended in what appeared to be tapering points rather than hands or feet. It lacked a face, clothing, and distinguishable features. It was merely a man-shaped hole carved out of the night's fabric. It arrived at my cab's passenger side and came to a halt. I thought it might rattle the door by peering in the window, but it did something far scarier. It extended one of its long, slender arms, touching the door handle with its pointy end. The passenger door unlatched, and I heard a faint metallic click. My blood became as cold as ice. There was a lock on the door. An hour earlier, I had locked it myself out of habit, yet I could hear it clearly. The distinct sound of the lock coming loose. The passenger door opened slowly and quietly. The cab's dome light should have turned on, but it didn't inside. The darkness persisted. In my peripheral vision, I saw the outline of the open door and a deeper stretch of night. The shadow then started to move in. Its limbs were so long that they collapsed inside the cab. A methodical, unhurried, and completely silent procedure. It resembled a spider scuttling into a matchbox. Its head almost touched the cab's roof when it unfolded into the passenger seat, not 3 feet away. It was in the truck with me. I was so terrified that I laid on my bunk with my eyes clenched shut, too scared to look. I sensed it. There was a noticeable chill, an emptiness that appeared to drain the air of all warmth and vitality. My house on the road, my haven, the taxi had been broken into and was now a grave. Something smelled to me, a slight, dry, dusty smell, like a grave that had been sealed for generations or the opening of an old book. It did nothing but sit. It remained still. There was no sound. It simply took up the room. It waits on my very soul in its calm, featureless presence. The most disturbing aspect was the silence. It was an alive silence, a suffocating, anticipatory emptiness. Every muscle in my body screamed as I lay there, waiting for something to happen, a touch, a sound, a last horrifying move. However, nothing appeared. I'm not sure how long I laid there with that creature in my passenger seat, frozen in the dark. Minutes, perhaps. It might have been hours. Time had lost any significance. The cab and the silent, dark passenger were the only things that remained in my entire universe. I was no longer a truck driver. I was a consciousness confined in a box with an unknowable dread. Eventually, the windows let in the first glimmer of dawn's weak grey light. The process of the light appearing was painful and gradual. I sensed a shift as the cab's pitch-black interior started to give way to a hazy grey. The stifling cold started to fade. It started to feel less like a weighty, watchful presence. I opened my eyes gently, with a courage I didn't know I had. I glanced in the direction of the passenger seat, after turning my head just a tiny bit. It was deserted. They had locked and closed the passenger door. The taxi was deserted. No evidence of anything having been there could be found. The sun was coming up. The birds had started to sing, and everything were getting back to normal. However, I wasn't. I was shattered. I hurried out of there as quickly as possible after starting the truck. I continued to drive till I was 100 miles distant, surrounded by the reassuring sights and sounds of other people and vehicles, while parked in the bright, crowded, and noisy lot of a huge travel center. Never again did I sleep in that pull-off. I no longer sleep in remote locations. I stay on the well-lit, cacophonous truck stops, where the night is kept at bay. I am aware of what is hidden. I am aware of what lurks in the quiet spots and deep woods. It need not shatter a window. A lock need not be forced. It simply chooses to enter. Furthermore, the creature that screams and claws at your door is not the most terrible thing in the world. It's the one that climbs and opens it, in, and simply waits for daylight, while sitting with you in solitude. I apologize for the earlier response's oversight. It seems that I left out a 10th narrative and only included stories 7, 8, and 9. The 9th story, with the shadow climbing into his cab as the ending, was where the original outline ended. But as a writer of horror screenplays, I am aware that sometimes the most horrifying stories are the ones that come as a surprise. Let's think of this as a bonus track, a track that is hidden at the end of the album. I'm going to compose my 10th story immediately, one to fulfill your request that wasn't in the initial list. This one explores the eerie quality of sound and the desolate Appalachian nighttime roadways. Callahan Thomas is my name. I'm on my final leg and I'm 62. I hope not in life, but in my work. After 40 years behind the wheel, I'm getting ready to park the rig for good. My wife and I purchased a modest home on the shore, where the salty air is preferable to the vehicle pollutants. As a man who has experienced everything, I've become accustomed to the oddities of the road. Silence isn't the most lonely sound in the world, as I've always claimed. It's the sound of a radio in the middle of the night, searching for a signal, a frantic quest through the static for a human voice. I never thought I'd come upon a station that wasn't searching for me, but was actually waiting for me one night in the twisting hills of West Virginia. I was transporting mining supplies up US Route 119 on a milk run, a route I could drive while I slept. This lonely asphalt road, which is frequently covered in fog and an almost palpable sense of sorrow, passes straight through the heart of coal country. The road was mine, and it was late, well after midnight. Long-distance truckers are familiar with the comfortable semi-trance condition I was in. My body was running on autopilot. My mind was quiet. I turned on my ancient CB radio to break the lull, but the stations were dead. In the midst of packing for retirement, I had neglected to pay my satellite radio subscription, which had lapsed. Thus, all I had left was the outdated AM/FM dial. The radio started its recognizable rhythmic search as soon as I pressed the scan button. A little of a gospel hymn rushed across static. There was a brief glimpse of a political discussion show, more static, and then silence. Unusually for this area of the Rockies, it was able to lock onto a signal with crystal clarity. There was only a voice and no DJ or station identification. It was a man's voice, deep and silky, with a soothing, almost hypnotic rhythm. He was reading names: William, Sarah Mae Johnston, and Elias Vance Bealey Cross. After reading one name, he would pause for a short while before reading the next. Only the voice and the list were audible. There was no music or sound effects. Intrigued, I listened for a few minutes. I assumed it was a memorial ceremony of some sort, perhaps a local church reading the names of the departed. The names had an air of antiquity, similar to those of worn gravestones. I continued to drive, the voice in my cab a constant, solemn companion. The list seemed endless. The voice paused after 10 or so minutes. A different sound emerged from the speakers than what I had anticipated: an advertisement or a station ID. The distinct sound was that of a telephone, an antiquated rotary phone being dialed. The dial turned and returned with a slow, methodical click, click, click. After dialing all 7 numbers, the line began to ring, twice. A woman's voice, small and far away, like though coming from the other end of a long, hollow tube, answered. "Hello," she murmured, her voice quivering with anxiety. "Is this Elias Vance's house?" the smooth-voiced commentator inquired. "Yes," the woman said in a strained voice. "He was my spouse. He died 10 years ago. Long time ago." "Who is this?" With an unwavering tone, the announcer said. "We have a message for him." "Whose message?" As if he were announcing the weather, the announcer said simply from beyond. The person on the other end of the line took a sharp gasp. After then, there was a stifled sob, the loud, startling sound of the receiver dropping, and finally the monotonous, steady tone of a disconnected connection. After a brief pause, the speaker resumed reading names without offering any commentary. Samuel P. Jones, Rebecca Finch, and Jacob Miller. My blood was frozen solid. The show was not a memorial. It was a radio broadcast informing the deceased's families that they had received a message from the beyond. I had never heard something so grotesque and strange. What sort of sick person would operate such a station? Anger shot through me. Wanting to get this disgusting broadcast out of my taxi, I fumbled for the scan button, but my hand stopped short. I was completely enthralled and horrified at the same time. I listened to the scene being replayed. For 10 minutes, The announcer read a list of names. He made a phone call. A bewildered, frequently elderly individual would respond. He would request a long-dead person. From beyond, he would deliver a message. It was always the same response. A dropped phone, anguish, and fear. The sensation of dread grew with every call. In its oddly macabre manner, the transmission was incredibly clear and professional. The announcer's tone was so composed, so emotionless. He led listeners into a surreal electronic underworld as a psychotic Virgil. His accent was eerily neutral despite my best efforts to place it. The voice of a typical mid-century broadcaster who seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. A horrifying idea started to take shape in my head as I continued to drive. All of the names had a regional accent. Miller, Johnston, and Vance. The mountains were known by these names. What if this was more than 100-mile away prank? Could this have been local? Could it have been real? After completing another list of names, the speaker started dialing once more. Click, click, whir. Click, click, click. With my heart thumping in tune with the clicks, I started counting the turns. The phone started ringing. A man replied in a rough voice. The announcer said, "Yes, is this Thomas Callahan's house?" The world came to a stop. The darkness, the truck, and the road all vanished. All I could hear was my name being called by the voice on my radio. The name wasn't widely used, not in this area. My knuckles went white as I clutched the driving wheel. It happened by accident. It must have been a different Thomas Callahan, to which the rough voice on the radio said, "He ain't here." I recognized the voice. Bill, my neighbor, was keeping watch over my house while I was traveling. As the announcer put it, "We have a message for him." A message? From who? Bill inquired in a dubious tone. "From his father," said the commentator. "My father. 20 years ago. My father passed away." I felt sick to my stomach and dizzy. I had the feeling that I would get sick. I wanted to shut off the radio so I could slam it with my fist, but I couldn't. Bill stated bluntly that his father had passed away. The silky voice of the announcer answered, "We know, don't sell the ancient house," is the warning. "You're mistaken about the well." I applied the brakes firmly. Tires smoking, the tractor screeched to a stop in the middle of the deserted highway. 100 miles away is the ancient house, my father's house, where I grew up. It was only last week that I put it up for sale. And the backyard well, the ancient stone-lined well that had dried up half a century ago. Regarding that well, my father had always been peculiar. Back in the 1960s, he had filled it with concrete himself, claiming it was unstable. However, I had never forgotten the expression in his eyes. A terrified expression. I heard Bill curse a series of words over the radio. "Who is this?" he screamed. "What kind of sick joke is this?" But the sound of the line cutting off drowned out his words. After pausing, the announcer broke format. He stopped reading names. He addressed me directly. "We'll be correct. After this, I'll be back with more messages for the road," he remarked in his usual silky manner. Then my cab was filled with a strange sound. It was a lament about a lost love, an old country tune from the 1940s. However, when I was a boy, my mother used to sing me her favorite song. A phantom radio station that knew my name, knew my goals, and was carrying messages from my deceased father was playing my dead mother's favorite song, while I sat there in my idling truck in the middle of a dark West Virginia highway, trembling violently. My logical side of the brain was yelling. It was a clever joke, a hack. My phone had been cloned, and someone knew my personal information. However, how were they aware of the well? My father had been acting strangely, but I had never mentioned it to anyone. For 50 years, it remained a mystery. The song came to an end. The voice of the announcer came back. "And for Thomas Callahan," he said, "a last message for the evening. We are aware that you are listening. We are aware that this is your final run. Our intention was to inform you that we will be waiting for you on the other side." Then one last sound. A sea of crackling. Hissing static drowned out the sound of a radio dial being twisted and the clear signal. I didn't hold off on seeing if it might return. After shifting the truck into gear, I took the wheel. Fueled by sheer fear, I drove through the remainder of the night. In the background, there was a mocking hiss of radio static. I left it running. I didn't want to touch it. I called the real estate agent first thing the following morning. The old house was taken off the market by me. What's in that well is unknown to me, and I don't want to know. There are some secrets that should remain hidden. I completed my run. It was the last time I parked my rig. I'm currently retired. I'm not at ease even though I'm sitting on my porch and gazing out to sea. I had one last story to share from the journey. One last terrifying mystery. I hardly turn on the radio these days. I like it quieter. However, I believe I can hear it occasionally in the late hours of the night, when the wind is just right. The static reading continued with a distant, faint voice. On a dark highway, a list of names awaits the next lonesome motorist, awaiting a final phone call. Thank you for viewing. If you love these articles, let me tell us which one chilled you the most in the comments below. Remember to subscribe, like, and share with your friends.